Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can you please ensure that all electronic devices are switched to silent? This morning we have apologies from Emma Roddick and Rhoda Grant is joining us remotely. Our first item of business on the agenda is consideration of whether to take item 3 and 4 in private. Are we agreed? Thank you, we are agreed. Our next item on the agenda is an evidence session with the Scottish Government Bill team on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. And this morning we're going to hear from two panels of Scottish Government officials involved in the bill. Firstly, we'll discuss provisions in the bill on nature targets, environmental assessments and national parks. For this section, a welcome to the meeting, Dr Jack Bloodsworth, the Principal Science Advisor from the Rural and Environmental Science and Analytic Service Division. My goodness, that's a mouthful. Leah Fitzgerald, the Head of Nature Division Bill Unit, Lisa McCann, the Head of the Biodiversity Unit, Norman Munro, a Solicitor from Marine Planning and Natural Resources Division, and Joanne Napier, Senior Policy Officer for Offshore Energy Environmental Legislative Reform Unit. So thank you all for joining us this morning. And before we begin, can I just say we have lots of questions we want to get through this morning and limited time, so concise questions and answers would be appreciated. And also just to remind you, you don't need to operate your mics. We have approximately until 10:30 for this first panel. So I'm going to kick off. We know the Scottish Government has overarching goals to deliver on its Scottish biodiversity strategy. So my question is, how will the statutory nature targets help achieve those, and how can that help in the fight to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 and to have restored and regenerative biodiversity across the country by 2045? Lisa.
Thank you. So good morning. We have for the past few years been working on what we're calling our overarching biodiversity framework. So that's made up of three main parts. First of all, we have the strategy, which sets out our overarching vision and our aim to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 and reverse declines by 2045. The strategy is underpinned by a series of rolling 6-year delivery plans. And in the delivery plans, we set out the actions that we need to take to achieve that overarching vision and aims. And then the third part of the framework is the Natural Environment Bill, and in particular, statutory targets. So we take the view that targets are a key way to drive action, to bring attention to the biodiversity crisis, and to help ensure that we galvanise action across government. They're a really important way to mainstream biodiversity thinking into our policy development and into our policy delivery. So while targets alone won't be what halts biodiversity loss and reverses declines, they're a really important way of encouraging action across government and to making sure that we are aware of the actions that we need to take and the importance of taking those actions.
We've got 12 months for this to be put in place, or 12 months in the bill to say that we've got to start putting into force these targets. If that's going to be 2026, 27, 2030, then is only 3 years down the road. Is there any chance at all that we might actually achieve what this bill sets out that its ambitions are? 3 years to reverse what is a biodiversity crisis?
So the bill alone is not the only thing that government is doing. As I've said, we've had a biodiversity strategy for many years. We just recently, last year, published the strategy and delivery plan. That sets out some of the key actions that are being taken across government. We have a lot that is already being done. The targets are just another piece in that jigsaw. They are an important way to encourage the pace and the scale of action to increase.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. The bill identifies 3 topic areas in respect of which targets must be set. I'd be interested to understand how those were chosen.
Yeah, so I'll a brief overview, and then I'll maybe pass over to Jack, who can give you the science.
Thanks.
So we have been, for a number of years now, going through quite an involved process, seeking advice and expertise from a number of experts to determine what is the best way that we can incorporate relevant areas within the biodiversity target. There's no simple way to measure biodiversity. It's a much more complex area than, for example, climate change. There's not one apex target that we can include. So therefore, there has been a really complex process that has been gone through to identify a number of targets that provide the right indication of how biodiversity is reacting to the actions that we are taking. But we have also been mindful to not have an overly complex or administratively burdensome reporting system with so many targets that may muddy the waters or mean that there isn't the right focus on what's being achieved. But I'll maybe ask if Jack could give a little bit more of the detail on the process that we've gone through and the science advice that we have taken.
Thanks.
No, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so as Lisa mentioned, we have a biodiversity programme advisory group, which is made up of a number of Scottish-based biodiversity experts across a range of different ecosystem types, also bringing expertise on the social sciences, economics, as well as some representation from scientists in ENGOs as well. So that group was brought together to advise on not just the natural environmental targets, but also the development of the strategy itself and the delivery plan. So we've got consistency in approach across the whole framework with the expertise which we pulling together. For the natural environmental targets themselves, we've been developing a four-step process for developing the recommendations for the targets. The first of those being setting out the policy framework, which is more answering questions as what types of targets would be best pulled together, whether they are outcome-focused, output or input-focused, as well as considering some other things around alignment with other pieces of work. The second step of the process, which is, I think, where your question mostly comes from, is around the target topics. So we initially developed within the Scottish Government a long list of target topic options, and we held workshops with that programme advisory group to refine that list on the basis of what's the minimum number of target topics, which will help us deliver the overall vision in the strategy. So it's been very much a collaborative approach with this group of experts. And the next stage of the process will be in step 3 was looking at indicators available for the target topics. But I'll maybe stop there because that's a bit more detailed than the original question.
Thanks for describing that process. I'd be interested to understand, so that you had that long list and the sifting process. Could you tell us which topic areas that were proposed by the Programme Advisory Board were not taken forward, and is it likely that we might see amendments at stage 2?
So I'll maybe take the first part of the question and then maybe hand back to Lisa for the second part, if that's okay. So the Programme Advisory Group came up with seven target topics in total. So they were ecosystem health and integrity, habitat, condition and extent, threatened species status, enhancing environmental conditions for nature. This is a long one. Citizens and society understanding, benefiting from and contributing to nature. So we like the long-winded things. Investment in biodiversity and positive outcomes in public sector policy. So we've taken forward 3 of those. I'll just comment on the 2 which are ecosystem health integrity and the citizen science one. So as part of our third step in the process, which is looking at available indicators, so things we can measure against these. The Programme Advisory Group determined that at the moment we don't currently have a suitable measurement approach for those two target topics, and we are developing.
Can you just rename those 2 topics?
Sorry,
again?
yeah, that's the ecosystem health and integrity and the citizens and society benefiting from understanding and contributing to nature. And I'll pass back to Lisa on the other 2 target topics which weren't taken forward.
Yes, so the other 2 target topics recommended were investment in nature and positive outcomes for biodiversity in public sector and government policy. So taking the first of those, investment in nature, it's not that we don't consider investment in nature to be incredibly important. As set out in the biodiversity strategy, we consider investment to be one of the key conditions for success and something that's incredibly important. But having looked at this and looked at the advice that came from the PAG, we took the view that this wasn't really an appropriate topic for a statutory target, that there was a risk of potentially perverse outcomes or actions simply to meet the target, which were not necessarily going to achieve the best biodiversity outcomes. So we are continuing to focus within biodiversity policy in ensuring that there is investment in nature restoration, but there was too much of a risk of potential greenwashing or, as I said, perverse results. So we have set that target topic to one side.
Okay.
The other target topic is positive outcomes for biodiversity in public sector and government policy. So this was about basically mainstreaming biodiversity to make sure that biodiversity is adequately considered. Again, this is a key part of delivering on our biodiversity ambitions. It's incredibly important that biodiversity is mainstreamed. But we took the view that we already have a strategy, we have a delivery plan. Those are actually much more effective tools for mainstreaming biodiversity, and that having a target could create an unnecessarily bureaucratic reporting mechanism, that it wouldn't necessarily be the way to achieve the results that we want to see, and that it could potentially result in resources being directed towards that reporting rather than actually delivery. It's probably helpful to point out that there is already an existing statutory duty on public bodies to further the conservation of biodiversity. So having a target would really just be a repetition in many ways of what is that already existing statutory duty.
Okay, I just want to pick up on both those two targets. So investment in nature, do you think there's anywhere that we need something that regulates that, that process?
So
Maybe it's not this bill, but something?
So there's already quite a lot of work going on across government to develop responsible private investment in natural capital. There was recently, I'm probably going to get the title wrong, Private Investment in Natural Capital Framework, I think it was called, which sets out principles. There is an ecosystem restoration code, which Scottish Government is now investigating and trying to bring forward. So there's already a lot of work in that space. You know, it's not really for me to say whether more is needed, but it feels like it is an emerging area with a lot of attention already being focused on it. And given that it's such a fast-moving area, perhaps statute isn't necessarily the right way to deal with that.
Okay, thanks for that. And then on the positive outcomes for public sector, I mean, I hear your point that there's already things in place for that. And there's even the National Planning Framework 4, where we've got the biodiversity policy there. But what I see on the ground is that we've got those policies, but it's not actually happening at a local level. So if we, and I also hear about the kind of onerous reporting. We don't want to add more reporting, certainly to local authorities, for example. But how do we actually get that idea and that aim to meet 2030 to actually flow down if we don't have targets? Are quite a good way to kind of set a focus.
So I agree entirely, and that's the purpose of the targets. It's really just on having that particular target topic and the difficulty in how you measure that. What type of indicators do you use? What type of reporting mechanism do you have? When we started to try to unpack that, we just felt that that wasn't actually going to achieve the outcomes, but instead having the focus on what are the biodiversity outcomes, you then need to look at what are the actions that need to be taken to deliver those outcomes. And that's where you'll really get that mainstreaming of biodiversity considerations in policy development and delivery.
Okay, but so what I'm just trying to get clear on is if we don't have it as a target, which I think I agree with you, because we don't want that onerous extra level of reporting, how are we actually going to get biodiversity transformation on the ground where there's kind of practices and ways of doing things that seem to be ingrained, even if we already have a biodiversity strategy in local authorities, for example?
Yeah, so I think the purpose of targets is to really bring to the forefront of policy delivery and development that what impact is the policy that I am developing or delivering having on biodiversity? What can I do to make sure that I am helping meet these targets that are now binding on government? So I think there's no straightforward way to do that. I think it's a range of things that we need to do, both within and without government, to make sure that people understand the impact of their policies on biodiversity, understand what it is that they can do to try to make sure that their policy is going to help deliver both our biodiversity ambitions and in due course targets.
Okay, Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Sorry, I was having trouble getting my mic switched on. Can I ask if you would summarise what the legal process will be for setting targets?
Yep, sure. So as set out in the provisions, there are 3 target topics. And there is a requirement on ministers to set at least 1 target in respect of each of those topics, and to specify the way that that target will be measured, or the indicators that will be used to measure progress. That is to be set out in regulations, and those regulations are subject to the affirmative procedure. There's also a requirement that in making those regulations, ministers must seek expert advice.
Okay, so there isn't, does expert advice, I guess, include scientific advice? Would that be seen as expert advice?
So the advice that ministers have been taking, as Jack outlined from the Programme Advisory Group, and I'll maybe let Jack speak in a minute about the range of expertise that there is in that. So my apologies, it is scientific advice in relation to the targets is the exact wording within the provision. So the Programme Advisory Group is, in our view, well placed to give that scientific advice. I'm not sure if it would be helpful for Jack to give you an explanation of the type of science advisors that sit on that group.
That would be helpful, but it would be also good to know if there is, if scientific advice is wider than that group, if that was available.
So there's nothing mandated within the provisions as to who ministers have to take advice from. The requirement is that ministers must seek and have regard to scientific advice in relation to the targets and topics.
Okay, so that wouldn't be limited to the group.
No, it certainly wouldn't be limited to the group. And if, for example, the view was taken that we needed to go wider to get some additional advice, that could certainly be done. There's no limitation within the provisions as to who the advice has to be taken from.
Okay, so then can I maybe ask kind of beyond the scientific advice, what steps would be taken to consult with people that were impacted by these targets, people, maybe stakeholders, but also people who might have to carry it out, and people who may face costs, people or agencies, to make sure that, you know, those targets are met, but also that there is no negative impacts and people have their say before they're set.
Yep. So I think, as I outlined before, the targets themselves aren't going to be what has the impact. It's the actions that need to be taken to deliver the targets. We've already had quite an extensive consultation process in respect of developing both the biodiversity strategy and delivery plan. We had 2 public consultations on the strategy. We've had a significant amount of engagement with a really wide range of stakeholders. We had a stakeholder consultation group that was made up of landowners, land managers, ENGOs, various different organisations, and they helped us in the development of the strategy and the delivery plan. So we feel that there has already been that wide range of consultation in terms of developing our biodiversity ambitions, developing that vision, and refining the actions that we need to take in order to deliver on those ambitions. There will need to be a further iteration of the delivery plan, and we would intend to go through a very similar consultation process. At this point in time, we had not envisaged doing any formal public consultation on the regulations for the targets. We were focused on seeking the scientific advice, giving the quite technical nature of what is in the targets, but we certainly wouldn't be doing that in isolation. We were being very clear and transparent about what the targets would be, and being willing to share whatever scientific advice we had received in developing those regulations.
I guess I'm not asking about you sharing, I'm asking about government listening, because it's really important to have stakeholders on board with all of this, especially when you're depending on people to actually go and help you meet those targets. And it's a bit concerning that there seems to be very little stakeholder engagement going forward. I appreciate what you say in the past and in development, but things will change if we're going to have to meet those targets. And I wonder how you're going to listen to people and bring them with you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fair point, and we did think about whether it was appropriate to include a public consultation requirement before making the regulations. But as I said, we took the view that the regulations themselves are really quite technical, and we weren't sure how helpful it would be to have a public consultation on those quite technical set of indicators and on the quantitative values to be set to those indicators. We felt that the consultation that we had carried out in respect of the fact of targets on the wide range of topics that could be included in those, and then about the actions and the impact of delivering those targets, was a good starting point to make sure that there was widespread stakeholder awareness of what government intentions would be. But I certainly take on board what you were saying in respect of the need to ensure, and the vital importance of making sure that stakeholders, general public, have a good awareness of what is being proposed, are on board with it, and we recognise entirely the importance of widespread delivery partners, our land managers, our landowners, the agricultural sector, etc. We're very aware of that, and I think that's set out quite clearly in the biodiversity strategy and delivery plan.
Can I just add? So obviously now that the bill has been published, we are starting to have conversations with stakeholders, and one of the things we're very interested in hearing from stakeholders is exactly the point that you made, Ms Grant, about how best they can feed into the process of the development of the targets. There is a wide range of stakeholders, a wide range of knowledge and expertise. We will have the PAG, but obviously there is vital information and expertise from stakeholders as well. So something we're very keen to hear from stakeholders is how they feel that they can feed into the process and what is the best way that we can engage with them as we develop this work. So we didn't want to be prescriptive at the start, because we very much want to take stakeholders with us and hear from them how best they think that they can help with this process to develop the secondary targets.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask, on a practical basis, how can landowners or land managers protect themselves and ensure that they're not going to be subject to intervention because the scope of the target is so wide and covers so many different areas, and you might have a piece of land that could be managed for preservation of internationally recognised peat bogs or heather or different species, but that might be at odds with promoting woodland enhancement. So how are you going to decide what features are going to be the prominent features, the features that you want to protect, and how can landowners, when they go about their day-to-day work, make sure that they don't inadvertently trigger an intervention, a legal intervention, on the basis that they are preserving nature, and it might not be what Nature Scott or whatever think that species or whatever might be.
So these are high-level targets that place an obligation on ministers to meet them. They don't give any additional powers to ministers to interfere with landowners. So I think you point to some of the obvious difficulties there are at the moment, but the targets themselves will not allow any specific interventions like that. The targets solely place an obligation on ministers to meet those targets. Okay,
thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you all. The bill gives Environmental Standards Scotland a new function to monitor the achievement of any legal nature targets. And I know that Environmental Standards Scotland was set up as a public body, I think October 2021, to ensure effectiveness of environmental law and prevent enforcement gaps arising from the UK leaving the European Union. So I'd be interested to hear what discussions that the Scottish Government has had with ES in order to then take up this new role.
Yeah, so we have had some broad discussions with ESS to make sure that they were comfortable that the proposed overarching functions that would be conferred on them in the bill fit with their existing statutory functions, and to have a discussion with them about the shape of those functions. We've had those discussions. but they have been at a relatively high level because until the bill was published, we were not able to share the exact provisions with them and the detail of them. So we plan to have those detailed discussions with ESS about how they see their functions operating in practice, about how administratively Scottish Government and ESS will need to work together, how we will be involved in information sharing, the type of monitoring, reporting, etc. Ideally, I would have been able to come here and give you a bit more detail of those discussions, but because the session has happened a little more quickly than anticipated, we've not yet been able to get a bit of time with the ESS to have that really detailed discussion. But I think they did appear before committee at some point recently and did say that they were having those discussions with Scottish Government and were broadly comfortable with that function and how it fitted with their existing statutory functions.
So no concerns have been raised yet about any resource issues or expertise or any other functions. I'm sure if there were concerns raised, that would be part of the engagement that the government has with us.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we need to make sure that they are comfortable with the functions, that they feel that they are something that they're going to be able to carry out, that they are comfortable with the process of how we will work with them within Scottish Government. And obviously it's for ESS themselves to determine what is the right resource that they need in order to carry out those functions.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Elena Whittam.
And good morning to everybody. The convener's already touched on this, but given that the goal to halt nature decline is by 2030, when will the Scottish Government be seeking to commence Section 1 to ensure that regulations are introduced within a meaningful time frame, given that tight time frame that's in front of us?
So I would assume that commencement will be a decision for the next administration, given the timelines that the bill is working to. We would hope that commencement would be as soon as practically possible. As Jack has pointed out, we're continuing to work really hard on what the detail of the targets would look like, so that we are as best placed to move as quickly as possible once that section is commenced.
Another thing that I would like to explore is why there's no legal requirement in the bill to align the targets with the overarching 2030 or 2045 goals, given that the policy memorandum does set out the intention for the targets to actually align with these timeframes as well. So why is that not in the bill itself?
So, Jack may want to come in this as well. We have tried to take the, first of all, the impacts that you see from biodiversity actions can be quite delayed. So there is quite a long time frame in terms of an action being taken and you seeing the biodiversity benefits of that action. So we know that while we are ramping up activity, it will be a slow increase in biodiversity as a consequence of those actions. We didn't want to be too prescriptive in terms of the provisions that are included on the face of the bill. Within the secondary legislation, we'll need to look at what's the appropriate time frame for setting those targets.
Yeah, just to add some of the sort of scientific perspective to that. So with meeting sort of nature restoration, it's often quite challenging to kind of map out the pathway to that, and there's lots of circumstances that can be quite challenging in terms of how to reach that overall restoration goal, particularly under a future changing climate. So I think just in the work with the Programme Advisory Group at the moment, in the step 4 of our process, which will be to pull together advice and recommendations around the actual numerical aspects of the targets, that's going to be a key consideration of what dates we put in and what would be scientifically feasible to achieve within those recommendations. And I think with biodiversity in particular, you need that adaptive capacity in there to be able to make changes as you go, particularly under that the impacts of a changing climate, where what we do now in terms of nature restoration might not be appropriate in 20 or 30 years' time, because we're working under a completely different climate.
So at this point in time, we're content that it's going to be an iterative process because of that long lead-in time to actually see the results of things, and that within secondary legislation, that's going to be the best way to deal with that, and not in the face of the bill.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel.
Lisa, I think you said in your earlier remarks that biodiversity strategy has been across government for years, but the Scottish Government has consistently failed to meet previous non-statutory biodiversity targets. So what's going to change in the making resources and implementation of biodiversity policy to give confidence that statutory targets will be achievable?
So I think that has been one of the reasons there has been this proposal to have statutory targets, because we have seen that statutory targets are a really effective way of galvanising government, of bringing focus to an area. We've known for quite a long time the things that we need to do to tackle the biodiversity crisis. Certainly there is a much greater focus and attention on biodiversity actions, and hopefully the targets will be another tool in making sure that the right actions are taken across government.
The consultation in 2023 said that successful targets will need to incentivise transformative change, which is, I think, the point that you're making. So what does the bill actually do to ensure that nature targets will be mainstreamed across all areas of government?
I think the very existence of targets has a really powerful influence across government. I think they are a really transparent way to identify what government is doing and the progress that is being made. They're something that draws attention to the fact of biodiversity, and therefore I think they will hopefully be one of the ways that we will increase that biodiversity activity that's needed.
Thank you.
Tim Eagle.
Good morning. Thank you for coming in. Just a quick question around the 30 by 30 targets, 30% of land and sea by 2030. I believe you'd thought about some legislation changes around that to help make that doable in the future, or in the foreseeable future, but there's nothing in the bill. So I guess the question is, what had you thought might be useful within legislation changes? Why aren't they in the bill? And therefore, how do you think you can make the progress instead?
Yep, so there was a consultation which, as you said, did include proposed changes to the existing protected areas legislation in order to, one of the proposals was to allow there to be a designation not just simply on the basis of a particular feature, but on the basis of an ecosystem. We also looked at ways to encourage management of protected areas above and beyond when there is damage to them, but where there is a slow decline. There was a pretty positive response to those changes, but equally there was a reflection that the protected areas legislative landscape is already pretty crowded and quite complex. Yeah. And so the view was taken that making additional changes to that suite of legislation would add to the complexity for land managers and landowners, and that there were other ways that we could potentially pursue the outcomes that those legislative changes would have, but in a non-legislative way, and therefore avoiding that additional complexity to the legislation.
The argument, though, is that it is quite a crowded and complex landscape. So actually, would it have been better just to sort of rethink all of that? Could that have been done within this bill and make it easier?
That would be an incredibly complex piece of work, yep. And that wasn't what we consulted on. Okay. So I don't think that that would really have been technically feasible within this
bill. Okay, but in terms of meeting the 30 by 30 requirements, how do you then progress that? If you're not going to do it through legislation changes, how do you sort of think that you're going to progress that moving forward?
Yep, so there's already a significant programme of work being undertaken within Scottish Government and with assistance from Nature Scot and various other agencies to develop the 30 by 30. There are a set of criteria that were set by the OECM, which we have consulted upon and worked with stakeholders to develop and make suitable for Scotland. There will soon be a range of pilots across some different land use type applying those criteria. So there's already quite a programme of work to implement 30 by 30 that doesn't actually require any legislative change. And sorry, I should have said, so that's focused on creating these OECM, so other effective areas for conservation. Okay. and they are a non-statutory type of area that is protected for nature, and it's done through contractual agreements, and it's a kind of a bottom-up approach where landowners, land managers recognise that they have a piece of land that could create significant biodiversity benefits. They then have that I won't say designated, but that is agreed that that is an OECM and meets towards our 30 by 30 criteria.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We're going to move on to part 2 of the bill. And question from Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. Excuse me. Good morning, panel, and thanks for your answers so far. Why does the Scottish Government need to take new powers to amend EIA legislation and habitats regulations?
Good morning. Thank you for the question. The purpose of taking these enabling powers is to allow for future amendments to be made to legislation in the light of these evolving circumstances that we've talked about for biodiversity and for climate. The EIA regime and the habitats regulations, they're key aspects of the legal framework which underpin environmental regulation and assessment in Scotland. It's not possible at the moment to predict every circumstances where the enabling powers would be needed, so we need to have that flexibility to be able to adapt to the future circumstances. Previously, ahead of Brexit, ahead of EU exit, these powers would have been amended through the European Communities Act 1972 under the 2-2 power. And since Brexit, the ability to make those changes through that act has been lost. So these powers will fill that legislative gap which has emerged following EU exit, and also allow us the flexibility to adapt to the future circumstances.
Government some flexibility to bring these back in?
Yes, absolutely, while still maintaining environmental standards and environmental protection.
Thank you. And can you also summarise what powers Scottish ministers already have in this area across the different pieces of legislation?
That's quite a technical legal question. There's quite a large patchwork of different regulations, as Lisa touched on, with the current picture of protected areas and environmental legislation, which has been made up over a number of years. There's quite a few different regimes that this cuts across. So the power that we're seeking here relates to the EIA regime, obviously, which the Scottish Parliament has legislative competency for. There are some powers which exist currently, which are due to sunset, so they will sort of have an expiry date, so they can no longer be used after a certain date. So this power that we're seeking is for the long-term adaptation and changes that we'd seek to make to the EIA regime and the habitats regulations. I don't know if Norman wants to expand at all on the current power that's available.
Yeah, happy to. So the power that's due to sunset is there is a power that exists in the Continuity Act, and that is due to sunset on the 29th of March 2027. And so the purpose of taking the power that's in the bill is to allow for future amendment of the EIA regime and the habitats regulations to happen beyond that date. There are other powers that exist, for example, in the Energy Act 2023, but that only covers offshore wind, and so it doesn't have the same breadth that this power has, that this power would be able to amend the full spectrum of the EIA regime as well as the habitats regulations. And so, as Joanne said, that the reason for taking this power is very much to plug a legislative gap that exists currently in the enabling powers available to the Scottish ministers.
Thanks for that. A key aspect of this bill is the purposes for which Scottish ministers can amend these regimes. How did you go about determining these purposes, and are the key drivers for including the different purposes? What are the key drivers?
So the purposes that were carefully considered on the face of the bill have been set out to enable the regulations only to be used for these purposes to enhance environmental standards or to meet targets for biodiversity or for climate. They were considered carefully so that the intention of the policy is that they enable enough flexibility to adapt to sort of future requirements while also effectively underpinning the environmental assessment and protection processes.
That's me, Convener.
Elena.
Convener, the committee took evidence last September from Fisheries Management Scotland, which pointed out to us that poaching for wild salmon and sea trout is the highest volume wildlife crime in Scotland. It also has one of the highest rates of conviction of any class of wildlife crime. However, we know that fish poaching has also got the lowest fines, under £250 on average, and that wild salmon has been classified as an endangered species. And there's a real concern that current fines do not act as a disincentive for this illegal activity. So FMS have identified that the Natural Environment Bill could be a potential means of introducing amendments to the Salmon and Freshwater Fisheries Act 2003. And it's just to actually flesh out whether officials would commit to working with FMS to examine the potential for an amendment to the bill to increase the fines for the most serious of fish poaching offences.
Obviously, when we were looking at this bill, which is quite a weighty bill, I mean, we have to be pragmatic and realistic about how much you can do via any one bill, and that is not something that has been raised with us before. It's not a policy area that anybody on this panel leads on, so I can't comment directly on that. Just to say we've not had any discussion so far, and ultimately, obviously, it's for ministers to determine whether they want to kind of bring forward any legislation. But obviously it's not a topic within the bill at present, and I'm not aware of how much work or consultation has been done in that. So it's certainly something that we as officials can bring to our Minister's attention that's been raised at committee today, but it will be for ministers to determine, speaking with officials who lead on that policy area.
Thanks very much, that's helpful. My next question is around about the fact that the bill allows for significant changes to be made to EIA and habitats regulations by way of regulations using the negative procedure, as the committee understands it, where those changes may have significant policy implications for how the regimes operate. And it's just to explore why the government's not considered the affirmative procedure to be more appropriate for a wider range of circumstances under these powers. I understand that the affirmative procedures is going to be used for some, but why not a wider suite of procedures in the affirmative?
So the reason that the either way procedure has been used in these circumstances is just to ensure that any use of the power is subject to an appropriate level of scrutiny. So there are some circumstances in which the power could be used to make relatively minor or quite technical changes to regulations, such as moving away from submitting paper copies of EIA reports to electronic copies. So in those circumstances, it really wouldn't be appropriate or an efficient use of parliamentary time to use the affirmative procedure.
So at this point, officials are content that the balance is struck correctly, that where the affirmative procedure is being used, it's in the most appropriate occasions to do that?
Yes, we think so. And having set out on the face of the bill the circumstances in which affirmative must always be used, just ensures that those checks and balances are in place. And then it will be up to ministers to decide on a case-by-case basis outside of those purposes whether they want to use the affirmative procedure or the negative procedure.
Thank you.
Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. The policy memorandum sets out that NGOs had encouraged the Scottish Government to include a non-aggression provision in this part of the bill, so powers could not be used to reduce overall levels of environmental protection, but this hasn't been taken forward. I'd be interested to understand why it wasn't taken forward, and in what circumstances might the Scottish Government use these powers in a way that would reduce overall levels of environmental protection.
Well, the intention of the policy is that the enabling powers need to provide the flexibility to be able to adapt to future circumstances. So as I've said previously, we can't predict all of the circumstances in which they might be needed at present. And a non-regression clause was carefully considered in the development of the policy, which is why we've set out the purposes for which the power can be used on the face of the bill. So that's the sort of limitations on the use of the power. It's also considered that a non-regression clause can be overly restrictive in the management of some protected areas. As we've touched on before, the regulations surrounding protected areas is a real patchwork and it's really complicated when there's some circumstances that have come in due to climate change and due to sort of evolving circumstances that mean it's not the most efficient way to manage them. So that's why we've set out the specific purposes on the face of the bill, and that doesn't include an non-aggression clause.
Okay, thanks. And continuing on to that, could you tell us how might the environmental non-regression provisions in the UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU interact with the Scottish Government's use of the powers in this instance if the regimes were amended in a way that no longer aligned with EU law? Kind of bit.
I think that's the question.
Thank you. The starting point is that the Scottish ministers are required to comply with the law, and that includes international law. Therefore, the exercise of a power, the power in Part 2 of the bill, will require to take that into account at the point of use. So at the point of use, the Scottish ministers will be required to take into account ministerial compliance with the international law that the EU and UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement is part of. And so that's something that would need to be considered in the round at the point of use. However, the starting point is that ministers are required to comply with the law, including international law in this instance.
Thanks very much.
Can I ask, can you just clarify what powers are going to sunset in 2027 and where these provisions are in the Continuity Act?
So the power in Section 1.1 of the Continuity Act will sunset on the 29th of March 2027.
And can you tell us what the difference is from the previous powers in the 1972 Act?
Certainly. So the difference is that the powers in the Part 2 of the bill are limited to amending the EIA regime and the habitats regulations, whereas the power in Section 2.2 of the 1972 Act was far broader. It covered implementation of EU law, and so if there was something that Scottish ministers, for example, were looking to implement, they could make use of 2.2 to do that, whereas in this particular instance it is restricted to the EIA, amending the EIA regime and the habitats regulations for the purposes that are set out in Section 3 of the bill, and so it's a narrower power.
Right, so all the other powers are going to be sunset apart from the ones you mentioned, or are going to be lost?
So the Continuity Act power will sunset and will be lost, and the Section 2.2 was lost as a result of Brexit, and so there is a legislative gap that the power in Part 2 of the bill is seeking to fill.
Okay, thank you. Tim Eagle.
That's the exact question I was about to ask.
Well, there you go.
So you just did it.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. One of the purposes for which Scottish ministers could amend these regimes is to ensure consistency or compatibility with other legal regimes, which includes the domestic regimes. So can you explain what changes are being considered at UK level in this area? For example, under the UK Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023 or the UK Energy Act 2023?
There are some changes being considered at UK level to move away from the EIA regime altogether, to bring in a new system of environmental outcome reports, which is more focused on the outcome of the development rather than the impact of the development. It's not the current policy of Scottish ministers to take forward that policy, so making these changes would enable us to keep the EIA regime in Scotland without moving to the UK regime.
So could you indicate what circumstances the Scottish Government might consider it appropriate to align with those changes?
There could be some circumstances, for example, remaining aligned with EU law. If EU law was going to enhance environmental protections, we wanted to keep pace with that. It is Scottish Government policy to keep pace with EU law. So we'd have to consider that obviously on a case-by-case basis as well. But if we were looking to enhance environmental, EU law was going to enhance environmental protection to a higher level, then we would seek to keep pace with that if it was appropriate.
Okay.
Rhoda Grant, if we've still got Rhoda.
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you, Convener. Can you explain how the powers of the bill can be used to change how European sites are designated? For example, would the power allow Scottish ministers to make it easier to withdraw the designation of a European site in certain circumstances?
The power could be used to make amendments to designations that would include the boundaries of sites or the features within sites. It would also allow us the flexibility to change the features within the sites, which we don't currently have following EU exit. So if we wanted to, for example, designate a site which is currently designated for wild birds for a different form of habitat and remove the wild birds, then that would be possible to form a regulation to do so.
Okay. And can I ask what safeguards are in the bill to ensure the integrity of the site network is maintained as a whole?
So I think that's a sort of wider question relating to the targets as well and to the wider biodiversity network.
Sorry, could you repeat the question then? My apologies.
So I'm just looking to see what safeguards are in the bill to make sure that the integrity of the site network is maintained as a whole.
So the bill sets out the purposes, so these are not unfettered powers to amend these regulations. So it has to be for one of the purposes that are set out under the bill, and then it would be subject to the appropriate parliamentary scrutiny, and there would be a requirement to consult upon those things. And these powers are very much looking at future-proofing, as Jack has kind of talked about in relation to targets. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future for climate change. So, for example, there are sites that might be protected for a species that in the future, due to climate change, no longer inhabit that particular area, but there might be new species there, and so it might be appropriate to change the designation of a site in order to ensure that we are meeting our biodiversity target. So it's very much, as I said, in relation to future-proofing, and kind of set out one of the purposes that we might need to use these powers is in order to make changes to the regime, whether that's to do with protected sites or other bits of it, in order to be able to meet our statutory nature restoration targets.
Okay, so you wouldn't see it as kind of pulling back on any of our commitments to nature restoration. It would be to tweak in the face of future changes and to increase.
Yeah, we're very much aware of the fact that we need to be flexible and adaptive to meet our climate change and biodiversity targets. And in order to be flexible and adaptive, then we need to have the appropriate powers where future legislation is required. We don't at the moment have any plans to make any changes to legislation, so this is very much about future-proofing and make sure that we've got all of the tools available in the future to be adaptive.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to section 3 on, or part 3 on national parks. And a question from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Okay, national parks. This natural environment bill has got inclusion about changing national park legislation. So I'm interested to know what the Scottish Government want to achieve overall by reforming the national parks legislation, and how will national parks and their management then change as a result of this bill?
Thank you. So the proposals are to update the legislation so that the aims of the national parks are a more adequate reflection of what our existing parks are already doing and what they will do in the future. The MREDI provide a really important leadership role in terms of tackling both the nature and climate crisis. So the changes allow a more adequate reflection of that role that they play. The other proposed changes will enable a fixed penalty regime to be put in place for bylaws, which will create a more effective and less administratively burdensome way for bylaws to be enforced within the parks.
Would the proposed legislation impinge or constrain current economic development? For instance, I'm thinking about the consultation that's going to hit, or just finish actually, for Dumfries and Galloway, because it's a big food-producing region. We are focusing on food security a lot of the time, so it's beef, sheep, Dairy, 48% of Scotland's dairy herd is in the South West. So will this Natural Environment Bill updating national park legislation constrain economic activity?
No. That's certainly not the intention, and that's not what we think would be the effect of the provisions. It's really just to, as I said, update the legislation to reflect what it is that parks are already doing within the aims of that are included in the bill. There is still about promoting sustainable economic, social and cultural development of the area's communities, because it's recognised that's a really important part of what happens within national parks. So there's certainly no intention to have any impact upon that agricultural and economic activity that's already taking place within the parks.
Okay, and as part of the reforms, I'm thinking about biodiversity enhancement and issues that the challenges, for instance, across the South West of forestry planting, which is part of forestry, it targets for carbon sequestration, but then there's impacts on ground nesting birds, for instance. I've learned so much about curlew and peeweets and all these other birds now that, thinking about how the bill will support improvements in biodiversity, for instance, but also in maintaining sustainable, regenerative farming, economic development, all of that.
Yep. So just to be clear, this is separate from the existing proposal that is currently under consideration to create a new national park in Dumfries and Galloway. So just to make sure that we're clear about that. So at the moment, as I said, our national parks are already doing a lot to tackle the nature and climate crisis. They play a really important leadership role. They work in partnership with other public bodies, organisations, land managers, and that's about collectively achieving the national park aims and implementing the national park plans. And those park plans are a very collaborative process involving a wide range of people who live, work in the national park areas. So what we hope is that by modernising these aims, it's bringing to the fore that work that our national parks do. The bill is really just updating the legislation to make it clear what's considered to be part of our national parks aims, and that specifically includes regenerating biodiversity and mitigating and adapting to climate change.
Okay, one wee more question. You said this Natural Environment Bill is separate from the current consultation. Does that mean the current consultation is based on the 2000 legislation, and will there be an overlap? Is this going to, the Natural Environment Bill, going to impede that process?
Yeah, so it might be helpful just to flag that the Cabinet Secretary wrote to the Petitions Committee to address that particular point yesterday, and we can certainly share that letter, because that committee had raised concerns about the potential for and the consultation on a new national park with the parallel changes being proposed to the national parks legislation. So as I've said, what's been done in the legislation is modernising the language of the aims and elaborating on what's considered to be part of those aims, and then strengthening the duties on public sector bodies who are operating within national parks, and then introducing the new powers to allow a fixed penalty notice regime for the contravention of national park bylaws. So the view is taken that that will not impact upon any designation process. The powers to designate a park that exist under the 2000 Act and that designation process are not affected in any way by what is being proposed in the bill.
Okay, thanks.
Just on that, so currently the Nature Scotland are going to report on a consultation where the people who are participating in that consultation are referring to an act which will be amended as part of this piece of legislation. So whilst you say there should be no conflict, there absolutely is, because people are responding to an old act which will not be in place if designation of Galloway National Park actually goes forward. It will look different. And whilst you're suggesting the differences are not significant, they potentially are. Where Nature Scot are saying that in their advice would be there be identification of priority nature zones in a national park and whatever, which would formally contribute to the 30 by 30 targets. Now, given the nature of Galloway, which has intensive industrial forestry, intensive dairy and intensive renewables, that might cause a conflict. So that the current consultation and this these potential amendments are could be viewed as having significant impacts on how people in the area might respond.
So I'll again just refer to the letter that the Cabinet Secretary put forward to the Petitions Committee to respond to that, and that the view that we have taken is that as the changes being made to the aims do not impact upon the existing powers to designate a new national park or the process, that we don't envisage any difficulties with the bill being considered by Parliament at the same time as the consideration of the potential for a new national park to be created in Galloway. I would also just add that obviously residents, businesses, individuals within the proposed area for a new national park can of course respond to the consultation on this bill and make their views known if they have any concerns about that.
Yeah, but it's not about the process of the consultation, this issue here. At no point during the consultation did the consultation suggest that the rules under which the National Park might operate would change during the point where the consultation was being taken. I think that's the issue. Then there was no opportunity for constituents to actually respond to the fact that the rules under which their area might have to operate is going to change. So this is not an ideal situation. It's not an ideal scenario that these two things are working in parallel. One should have been done before the other, and preferably this Natural Environment Act with the National Park changes would have been in legislation before a new national park would be consulted on, surely.
So I guess I would suggest that that's perhaps a matter to raise with the Cabinet Secretary rather than can only focus on the provisions in the bill just now. But what I would say is that we have carefully considered the implications of potential changes to the Act and took the view that the changes that were being made were a reflection of what our existing parks were doing, and therefore there was no specific difficulties with that. And I guess it's probably maybe helpful to add that any designation order that would be made in respect of a new park would also be subject to significant consultation requirements as set out in the 2000 Act, which again are not impacted upon by the changes we're making in the bill.
Okay. What type of review has been undertaken to look at the performance of the existing national parks in relation to how they are performing under the current legislation, but also potentially under the new legislation that these amendments would bring forward? Has there been any review of their performance?
No, there has been no review, but both the national parks are required to report to both Scottish ministers and to Parliament in respect of the exercise of their functions. Again, is it not a sort of cart before the horse? Surely we should be able to understand how the parks are performing under the existing legislation before making amendments to change that when we don't actually know whether they're performing or not. So, as I said, there already is a process in place where national park authorities are accountable to their boards and to Scottish Government, and it's also open to Scottish Parliament to scrutinise the park's performance. Okay, thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. My question is similar but slightly different, and I'm hoping that it might enlist the response we're looking for. What is wrong with the current national park legislation that requires these changes to be made?
So I think there's nothing that is dramatically wrong with the existing legislation, but it felt that it was appropriate, given the passage of time since the original National Park legislation was passed, to update the legislation to be a more accurate reflection of what it is and how our existing national parks are operating.
Can you be more specific about what needed to change and why?
So there are some changes that were made to the existing aims to bring out more the role that the national parks can play in terms of promoting the cultural heritage of the area and also in terms of tackling the biodiversity and climate crisis. And then also there's the additional obligations or the additional requirements on public bodies operating in the park to assist with implementation of the National Park Plan. And then there is the quite important provisions, which are quite technical, but which will enable a fixed penalty notice regime to be implemented in respect of bylaws.
So it appears to me that the only real change, material change, is the fixed penalty notice.
So that obviously is an important part of the changes that are being made, but the provisions which, I'll just find the right part here, that make changes to how other public bodies operating in the park have to pay attention to the National Park Plan. I just want to find the right provision so I can get the wording right. I should have worn my glasses. Do you want to know them? Thank you.
So there's a change in Section 7 of the bill as regards the national park plans, and it's a strengthening of the duty on public bodies and office holders to, previously it's the duty currently in the 2000 Act is to have regard to national park plans, but there's a strengthening of that duty to require them to facilitate so far as consistent with the exercise of their other functions and duties, the National Park Plan. So there is a strengthening of that duty in Section 7 of the bill.
Okay, that's maybe interesting for other legislation, because we've been told previously that having regard to is pretty cast iron. But I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you, Rhoda. Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Can I just, I'm going to come to this point in a second, actually, about to have regard to. I love a bit of legal terminology, but can I just go back, first of all, to Emma Harper's point around economic opportunities within national parks? I think that's quite a critical point, actually, because just double check I've got this right. We've got the current Section 1 in the 2000 Act, which has the 4 principal aims of the national park. You are slightly tinkering with those, but not very much in this new bill. But then you're adding on 6 new in a new Section 1(2), which adds on these 6 new things, which are around actually what we're talking about: natural environment, biodiversity, etc. And basically, they expand upon the main aims, the main 4. Apart from none of those 6, they talk about access, they talk about biodiversity, climate. None of them talk about the economy and the economic within development within the national park. That concerns me slightly, because actually we do have not just farmers, but lots of businesses that operate in these parks. So just, you know, why would you not add another one in there that just talks about enhancing, protecting the sustainable economic development of these areas?
So within the overarching aims...
Within the new Section 1(2).
Yeah, but within the overarching aims, we have quite clearly that one of the aims is to promote sustainable economic development. So that is very clearly stated.
But within the overarching aims, you're pretty clear that you want restoring and to conserve and enhance the area's natural and cultural heritage, to promote sustainable management and use of natural areas. I mean, these are all things that you've also got in those, I would have argued, in those 6 new Section 1(2), apart from to talk a little bit more specifically about economic development.
Yep, so given that biodiversity and climate change are considered to be key key activities that the national parks carry out, it was felt that it was important to expand upon those and expressly refer to those. But given that there is no change in terms of the economic development, it was felt that that was adequate to include the provision of economic development.
Okay. Maybe I'm missing the point. Maybe you felt that they needed to be expanded upon. I sort of look at them and think oh, actually, those 6 are kind of already inbuilt into the original 4. But we'll ask. I mean, it'd be interesting as we take evidence from various bodies whether they think that that is inherently, you know, we don't need to talk about this more because that's it. It's there. It's clear. But we'll find out.
They do also refer to, you know, supporting access and also quite significantly promoting sustainable tourism and visitor management.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Thank you. I'll move on. So just to go back to the point that was made by Norman Munro a minute ago, statutory duty has changed from have regard to facilitate implementation of. What does that mean in practice to a local authority or other public body in the area?
Well, ultimately, it will be for the local authorities, for example, to take their own legal advice on to how implementing these duties once the bill is in force. However, the Scottish Government's position is that there is a strengthening of the duty here in that it places a greater emphasis on the facilitation of national park plans. And so, whilst the have regard duty, and as Rhoda Grant mentioned earlier on, it is a firm duty. Everything that says that a public authority, for example, must do X, Y and Z is a firm duty on the public authority, and they are required to comply with that duty. It's considered that the policy intention here was to strengthen the duty on public authorities for the actual facilitation, so far as consistent with their existing duties. So in terms of what that will mean on the ground, that will depend on the circumstances of the individual case, and the local authorities, for example, will need to take their own legal advice on how to, when faced with a question of implementation or facilitation of a policy which may engage the National Park Plan, they need to consider that as part of the round and as part of the fulfilment of their own legal duties.
Can you make could you suggest what you know, what's your thinking behind that? I mean, if I'm a councillor sitting in one of our wonderful councils and there's a national park that covers part of my ward, and in the past I've got a paper, I'm struggling for cash, but in the past I've got a paper which covers part of that national park area, and I've had regard to the plan. I think, well, actually, I understand what they're trying to do, but I've got to go in this direction. But now I've got to facilitate the implementation of that plan. So that might come with an economic consequence or a financial consequence, or that might come with a consequence on what I can do in terms of planning or education or anything else. So, I mean, develop that a little bit more. I mean, what do you expect the local government lawyers to say to that?
One of the key points also to make is that whilst you are correct that the have regard, the example that you've given of having considered it but needing to go a different way because of a multitude of other factors, there is still a caveat to the duty to facilitate in Section 7.4, it's to be inserted into the 2000 Act as well, in that it states that the public body or office holder is to comply with the facilitation duty, but only so far as their existing functions extend. And so if they are faced with a situation where they have competing legislation, for example, and they have to consider which of the two to comply with, the duty only in this bill, only so far as it extends to their other functions, will mean that in that particular instance, the other consideration would be able to prevail.
Okay, I think I understand. Thank you.
Emma Harper.
You've probably covered this already, but it's just to go back to the original National Park legislation was in 2000. There was no biodiversity crisis, no nature crisis, no climate crisis at that point. So the updating of this legislation will helpfully bring, I suppose, more into line what is happening right now in terms of biodiversity loss and nature loss and climate issues and things like that. So I'm thinking about how, you know, flood management and all of that is part of it. So that's really my question. It's bringing up to date the legislation that was delivered in 2000, really. That's what this Natural Environment Bill is going to do.
Yeah, exactly. The intention is to simply update and modernise the aims of the park so it is a more accurate reflection of what our existing parks do and what is that we hope they will continue to do in future.
Okay, thanks.
I've got one final question, but I want to go back to the topic that Tim Eagle was referring to and why there was a decision to include a list of aims including it says without limit to the generality of subsection 1, those aims include. But in areas, again, and we've got to be very conscious of this, an area that's potentially going to be designated as a national park, the economic future for Galloway is not reserved to recreation, tourism or visitor management. We do have significant, or the most significant commercial forestry in Scotland, based in an area in Galloway. We also have the most significant dairy industry in Scotland and potentially United Kingdom. And we also have one of the areas which has the highest concentration of renewables. But that has been excluded from the list. Now, that must have been a conscious decision that those industries were not mentioned on at all. So why would an area that's potentially going to be Scotland, the only area that's been identified as Scotland's next national park, those aims look like excluding all economic activity other than tourism and recreation within the area?
Well, aim F, and I appreciate people will look at things in different ways, so we'll obviously be interested to hear the views of the committee, whether there is some expansion in that part of the aim to reflect what we've set out. But it does, say that the new subsection that promoting sustainable development activity which improves the health, well-being and the prosperity of individuals and communities within the area. So, that is that economic prosperity, and that has now been added to the subsection, so we would hope that that would address the point that you and Mr Eagle have made, but obviously we're very open to hearing any recommendations the committee has about whether that could be strengthened.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, you've already touched on the fixed penalty notice regime. Can you kind of set out what you believe the impact of this new fixed penalty notice regime would be, and what do you envisage the resources that a National Park Authority would need to make those powers effective?
So the intention behind introducing a fixed penalty regime is to help ensure improved compliance and behaviour change, while also providing a more proportionate means of enforcement than the quite administratively burdensome process of reports having to be made to the Crown Office and the time and expense to the public purse of individual cases, which in some instances could be seen as disproportionate to the maximum penalties that are available. So the hope is that it will allow minor and technical offences to be dealt with quickly and effectively. It will reduce the likelihood of reoffending. Hopefully it will improve standards and encourage increased compliance and allow rule breaches to be dealt with more effectively. So if someone is issued with a fixed penalty notice, they are not required to attend court. It should reduce the burden on the court service and on the Crown Office, and it hopefully will give more flexibility to park authorities by giving them an additional enforcement option, which is an alternative to seeking prosecution in the criminal courts. So I think you asked about what the resource implications would be. So I think that when we have spoken with Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, they had estimated an additional cost of £8,500 in terms of staff training, public communications, etc. Given that Cairngorms National Park do not currently have any bylaws, it's much more difficult, obviously, to estimate what the resource implications would be for them. But I think it would be fair to use the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park cost estimates as a proxy for potential costs in Cairngorms.
Okay, thank you. So, at the moment, there are fixed notice penalties for the likes of littering and fly tipping in Loch Lomond and Trossachs. Can we give examples of where else the fixed notice penalties might be used?
Offences which might be used.
So at the moment, I need to remind me which park it is, Lisa, but one of the parks is Loch Lomond, excuse me, has currently finished a consultation on whether to introduce Cairngorms, whether to introduce bylaws in relation to wildfires. So those are the kind of things that in future that might be appropriate for a fixed penalty regime. So it will very much depend on what future bylaws national parks look at, but they will obviously consult before creating, they have a duty to consult before creating any bylaws, and as part of that consultation process they would also consult on whether it would be appropriate for that bylaw to be subject to a fixed penalty. But certainly the wildfire one is one that people have pointed to as something of great importance, where having the power to issue bylaws could be very effective in helping reduce wildfire risk.
Okay, so in practice that could be finding someone who sets up a barbecue or a campfire in a certain period in the year that could be dangerous. Is that the sort of practical implications?
So there is a proposal that is with ministers at the moment in respect of seasonal wildfire bylaws, and I assume it covers things like that. Maybe just I found the right part of my briefing. So at the moment there are bylaws in Loch Lomond and Trossachs that include measures to tackle antisocial behaviour and to improve public safety on Loch Lomond in respect of recreational usage and minimising irresponsible navigation. So it's those types of bylaws which potentially could become part of the fixed penalty notice regime.
Great. Thank you very much. And that concludes our questions. Absolutely bang on time. So thank you very much for your succinct and very informative responses to our questions. And thank you for joining us this morning. I'm now going to suspend the meeting for 15 minutes and we'll return to look at the next section in the bill. Thank you. Thank you. We now resume. Welcome back. And we're now going to hear from a panel of Scottish Government officials involved with provisions in the bill on deer management. And I welcome to the meeting Hugh Dignan, the Head of Wildlife Management Unit. Leah Fitzgerald returns as the Head of Nature Division, the Nature Division Bill Unit. And Norman Munro, again from the Solicitor, Marine Planning and Natural Resources Division. So thank you for joining us. We've got till approximately 12 o'clock for this part of the session, and I'll move straight to Ariane Burgess for the question.
Thanks, Convener. I'd be interested to understand why the current legislative framework for deer management hasn't worked in terms of controlling deer numbers adequately in Scotland.
Morning, and yes, I wouldn't say that it's the legislative framework that's failed to keep deer numbers down. There are a number of factors for that, but clearly having the right deer management legislative framework in place is an important way of, or important factor in helping address high deer numbers. And so that is what we're doing with this bill here, is we're trying to put that framework in place to enable effective management of deer and effective intervention where necessary to reduce deer numbers.
Okay,
but there are a number. Sorry.
You're gone.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, there are a number of things which have got in the way, and we are trying to address those here. And so you'll, no doubt, we'll get onto it. But some of the sort of triggers for intervention, which we think are an important change, should help with that.
Okay, so if you could actually kind of spell out maybe what are the problems, numbers is one part, and then tell us how you think this bill is going to address them.
Well, I think there's probably two elements to this. There is the broad recognition that we need to do more, that we need to get deer numbers down, and that will involve more culling effort. And then, so we need to put in place the necessary sort of framework to allow that to happen safely and effectively and efficiently. And so there are provisions in the bill which are around that, which are around competence and are around the way that sort of people can be authorised to carry out certain acts of deer management. And there are also the rare but important occasions when Nature Scot will need to intervene in deer management. And so the bill looks at some of the obstacles that have got in the way of that in terms of the process. And it also looks at the grounds for which Nature Scot can intervene. And so it sort of broadened those slightly, and it's also then taken those grounds for intervention and used those as the grounds for authorising other activities, such as shooting at night or shooting out of season and so on.
And so in connection to the Deer Management Working Group's recommendations, so some of those are coming, that's some of what's in this bill is about being able to implement them.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of the main sources of the sort of provisions in this bill are the recommendations which were brought forward by the Independent Deer Working Group. But it's not just that. There are sort of some important things which, I mean, that group, I mean, it reported in 2020, I think. Since then, I think we've had a clearer focus on what we need to do in terms of biodiversity and in terms of climate change, and so there are additional provisions in the bill which we think will help us address the Scottish Government's wider goals in that. But the sort of modernisation aspects, a lot of those derive from the DWG report.
Okay. And and that clearer focus on biodiversity, that's come from the commitment of 30 by 30, protecting 30% of Scotland's land by 2030?
I mean, that's one of the elements, but I mean, it's also, I think, the recognition that there is a significant taxpayer investment in things like planting trees, restoring peat and so on, which are some of the main levers the government has for addressing nature loss and for reducing carbon emissions, and it's to prevent those significant taxpayer investments being damaged or degraded by high deer numbers. So that's the sort of linkage there.
Okay, thanks very much.
Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. With regard to the changes made to the aims and purposes of deer management set out in Section 10 of the Bill, how will public interest be defined? And given that it can vary in contexts and also it can change over time?
Thank you. I mean, that is a very important point in that it will change and vary in time. It will also change and vary according to context. But clearly, public interest is, I mean, this isn't the only piece of legislation where public interest is a key issue. And so, thanks, as well as other legislation, it's also currently within the Deer Act, where there are actions which are for public interest of a social, economic and environmental nature. So it's already partly within that. But there is some sort of legal sort of explanation of this. So public interest, broadly speaking, encompasses the collective needs, values and interests of society as a whole, rather than those of individuals or specific groups. The expression is to be understood and applied contextually, and what constitutes the public interest in different situations may be different. It may also evolve and change over time. So I don't think there is any one static definition here of what the public interest is. It's something which is a concept which is used in other legislation. It's used already within the Deer Act, and there is a sort of general understanding within the legal sort of profession of what public interest means in interpreting legislation. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
So, in terms of public interest, it's not defined in the bill itself, but Hugh has set out some of the main considerations. It would be incumbent upon the Scottish ministers when considering matters of public interest and Nature Scotland applying that to act reasonably in what they're doing as public authorities. And so they would need to consider all the circumstances in the round before making a reasoned and proportionate view on what constitutes the public interest. And it should also be noted that the Deer Management Code of Practice currently contains a reference to public interest and what that is, encapsulates currently. And the Code of Practice will continue to evolve over time, and so it may be that definition can also evolve over time, as Hugh has already mentioned.
Thank you.
Tim Eagle.
Thank you, and welcome, Hugh, to the committee. Norman and Leah with us before. The bill sees the addition of the word environment that Nature Scot must account for. So I guess the question for me is what criteria or metrics will be used to assess that environmental impact, and how will that be balanced by local management?
So, in terms of metrics on assessing impacts on the environment, is that the particular...
Well, the bill sees the addition of the environment for things that Nature Scot must account to. So I guess what was the purpose of that addition, and what do you know, how are you going to assess that? What does that mean in practice?
Well, in terms of managing the impacts on environment, I mean, that has long been part of the sort of requirement for Nature Scot in terms of how they look at deer management. In terms of the metrics of how that's assessed, there are metrics in terms of deer management plans and in terms of habitat assessment and so on, but I'm not quite clear what you're getting at in terms of how Nature Scot will assess impact on environment. Is that what you're asking me about?
Well, maybe I am wrong on this, but my understanding was that Nature Scot currently have a range of things they can look at when considering deer management, but now the new word environment has been put in. So I guess, what does that mean to a land manager? If Nature Scot can come and say, well, actually, I can have regard to the environment before I put in place a deer management plan or force you to do X, Y, and Z, what does that look like to a land manager on the ground? That's my understanding, at least, that is a new addition, isn't it, the word environment?
Well, I think some of these arise from recommendations from the Deer Working Group, and I think a lot of what the Deer Working Group were doing there was looking at being more specific to reflect the reality and the actuality of what Nature Scot does. So I don't think that adding environment in this purpose is going to actually change a lot of what NatureScot do. It's rather reflecting what they have been doing and making sure that the functions and aims are in line with what's actually going on. So in terms of when NatureScot are looking at how deer management plans will work, how effective they will be, about what effective deer management means when they're looking at the sort of grounds for intervening, clearly the impact in the environment is a key consideration in terms of assessing what the public good is, what the public interest is, and whether or not that sort of intervention is justified. So in terms of the metrics for that, of assessing what the impact on environment is, as I said, there are a range of issues around looking, for example, at impacts on natural processes for regeneration, at looking at processes for carbon sequestration or carbon emission, at looking at trampling impacts on watercourses and so on. So there are a number of things which one could look at to assess the impact on the environment. But I don't think this is a new thing for NatureScot to be doing in terms of its functions. It may be that we are being more specific about what's involved in terms of setting out that in terms of functions and purposes of NatureScot.
So this is just, in your mind then, this is just an addition of a word, but it doesn't really bring any real difference to NatureScot. I mean, one could argue then, is it required at all?
I think you're maybe talking about the reference to the insertion in section 10 in relation to the impact, where it currently says impact on natural heritage and then the environment's been added to that. Right. So I think that's just to clarify and make it very clear that, due to the impacts on deer, so kind of going forward, NatureScot will need to kind of, when they're considering and formulating deer management policy, to take effect of the kind of the cumulative impacts of deer across Scotland and the impact that they may have, populations may have, for example, on biodiversity and carbon emissions, both on a regional and a national level. So I think, as you'll be aware, that the Deer Act is quite an old piece of legislation now, and so it is very much bringing that up to date to kind of recognise that going forward, the impact of deer on the environment will be crucial and something that very much has to be taken into account in relation to that section of the Act.
Okay, thank you.
Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. My question's about advisory panels. How do they function, and is NatureScot's active involvement in them a significant change that will improve decision making?
Advisory panels are not new, so they've been in the Deer Act for a while. The purpose is to advise on deer management actions, obviously, as the title suggests. Again, it's one of the DWG recommendations that NatureScot staff should be able to be on those panels in order for their expertise and their knowledge to form part of that panel. Again, I don't see this as a significant change in the way panels operate. NatureScot staff are already involved in servicing those panels and providing the sort of secretariat support. So actually having people with particular expertise from NatureScot on the panels, I think, is something which is and as far as the DWG were concerned, is a sensible but reasonably minor change.
Okay, thank you.
Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel, and thanks for your answers so far. Can you advise the reason for changing when NatureScot can review compliance with deer management rules? And how will NatureScot decide what is an appropriate time to carry out a review?
I think that this was something which was originally put in that there was a 3-year requirement, so it's to be done every 3 years. And I think, again, another DWG recommendation, that they thought that was probably unnecessarily prescriptive, and that to require that every 3 years was sort of an undue sort of burden on resources. So I think what we're looking at now is that NatureScot can review compliance, or they can be asked to review compliance, but that there is a backstop that they do it at least every 10 years.
Could I also ask who can ask for a review?
I think that's ministers can ask for review, and I guess if through ministers, if there is pressure for people to look at this, that would come through the government, and the government would then require NatureScot to carry out their review.
Okay, thank you. That's me, convener.
Thank you. Can I ask what the purpose of adding nature restoration as a reason for intervention in deer management, and how does that align with the broader goals of the bill?
This was one of the sort of key changes that was made, and it's outside of the DWG recommendations. And so I think one of the, there are a number of aspects of this, but one of the sort of fairly fundamental points is that there is considered to be a difference rather between intervening to rectify damage or to prevent damage and intervening to allow something to be enhanced or something to be changed. So these are really to ensure that NatureScot can take a proactive role in intervention rather than having to wait until damage is either being caused or likely to be caused. Another sort of related part of that is that there have been, for a long time, issues relating to the measurement of damage. So to have robust arguments around the extent of damage caused, it's very important you have a baseline from which to measure. And those baselines for damage only really exist in protected sites and some other sites. So in areas where you don't have that baseline for damage, it's very difficult to intervene to prevent damage or to prevent future damage. So the restoration part really is about being able to intervene proactively to allow nature restoration, and to allow nature restoration in circumstances where damage may have been done a long time ago and is no longer occurring. So there are a number of sort of circumstances around that, but it's really about intervening proactively rather than reactively, which is how the current version of Section 6, 7 and 8 are set up.
I think one of the confusing things is actually how to clarify an enhancement of the natural environment. Whether it's preservation, protection, restoration, they're all pretty subjective and open to different definitions. So I suppose the difficulty arises is whether damage by deer and how that can be established is predicated on how someone defines preservation, protection, restoration and enhancement of the natural environment. How is that going to be demonstrated?
I think this links into, obviously this is something that NatureScot have to make, assessments in relation to environmental impacts in relation to a range of their duties. So this is not a new thing, but it kind of feeds into this wider work that we are undertaking in relation to our biodiversity strategy, our biodiversity delivery plan, and action plan, where we will be kind of proactively looking at, well, what do we need to do in order to meet those targets and to meet those things. So, there will be quite clear sometimes where areas have been developed has been in a degraded state and that action is required. But as I said, this is something that NatureScot and the government have to do across a range of things, is assess environmental impacts, environmental damage, look at where we need to make interventions to help, restore and enhance the environment. So that's kind of, it fits within that broader context, but you might be able to say more about the detail of these specific provisions. I should just add as well that NatureScot will also be required to set out in the Code of Practice examples of the kind of circumstances in which the powers of intervention could be used as well.
Yeah, I think that particular point is important, that the Code will set out the circumstances in which intervention might be considered. But the interventions are around deer management, so it's where the impacts of deer are preventing natural processes or the fulfilment of projects or plans which are part of a scheme or enactment or a project. And so there are some sort of constraints around when this can happen. And it's important to bear in mind that any scheme which is proposed for compulsory powers under the nature enhancement, nature restoration, will need to be approved by ministers, and is, of course, subject to further appeal if that was required. But so it is about deer management. It's about where deer are having an impact on this. It's not wider than that. It's not about a power to require restoration or enhancement. It's where existing plans for restoration or enhancement are being frustrated by high levels of deer, high deer population, and it's about then being able to take the action to reduce those deer numbers to enable that sort of restoration project to take place.
Okay, thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you. I am interested in how the bill changes the process for creating and approving deer management plans, and what will a deer management plan look like?
Deer management plans obviously are widespread and in widespread use right now by deer management groups across Scotland. So they're well understood as to what they are, what should be in them. Very few of them actually fall into the sort of compulsory or intervention processes of Nature Scot, but those plans are things which set out the actions that need to be taken among a group of land managers who operate across an area where deer being a mobile species, collaboration is obviously important. So the plan covers a range of land holdings and sets out what needs to happen in order to achieve sustainable and effective deer management. There are changes in the legislation here now about where Nature Scot require deer management plans from people, and that is changes around the timing. So I think the bill allows Nature Scot to request a deer management plan be submitted on a shorter time frame than present. I think it was 12 months was under the existing legislation, and the new legislation it will be 3 months. And again, that was a recommendation that arose from the DWG, the Deer Working Group. But it's about ensuring that where Nature Scot want to start focusing closely on an area of land and looking for deer management plans from landowners or a landowner, that they are able to have a more effective way of getting that information that's required for them to understand what's going on, what the landowner proposes to do, and what they may be required to do in response. So I think there are also changes in terms of ensuring that the grounds for starting to look at where a deer management plan is required, that Nature Scot are satisfied under the new grounds, which, as I said earlier, the grounds in 6ZA and 6ZB, which will apply across the whole range of deer management issues. That's what's driving them to start focusing on where a deer management plan requires to be submitted to them.
You mentioned 6ZA and 6ZB, and I'm just looking at the legislation, or the proposed legislation right here. It talks about relevant owners and occupiers of a particular area of land, and requiring those owners or occupiers to prepare and submit a deer management plan. Can you clarify? I'm thinking about tenant farmers here, because they have deer management issues as well. Can you clarify on whether the deer management plan notices will be given to all landowners and occupiers, or landowners or occupiers? Who is responsible then for receiving the plan, then creating a plan, if I'm a tenant farmer but the landowner receives the notice to have a plan?
I guess broadly speaking, it's whoever is responsible for managing the deer on the land. So I don't think many tenant farmers have deer management responsibilities.
Okay, What if they want the responsibility then, or they are designated to be responsible for deer management because the landowner doesn't want to do it?
Well, I'm not sure on what would happen where the tenant farm was stepping forward and saying, I will take on responsibilities that aren't mine. I guess that would require the consent of the landowner. But clearly, this is a sort of situation now where we are looking for as many sort of ways of getting deer management done as possible. And if there are people wishing to take a role in that, and that's lawful, that they're not transgressing on the rights of the landowner, there'll be no problem with that. But the law here really applies in the first instance to those who have responsibility for managing the deer on the ground.
Okay. And I know, I mean, you say that if somebody... We have a deer management problem. We have a deer problem in Scotland, and I know... Yeah. Can you say something about just for the official record, about the task in hand in terms of needing to manage the deer population in Scotland?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a serious issue. It's an issue which really is pretty fundamental to the achievement of a lot of our biodiversity and climate aims. I think, the deer numbers are... There's a lot of debate over how many deer there are in Scotland. Possibly up to 1 million animals, and that is a number which has doubled since the 1990s, and that number in itself had doubled since first sort of deer management in the 1950s. So, we now have at least 4 times as many deer as there were, 30, 40 years ago. We think that we need to sort of seriously increase the cull level to bring numbers down, perhaps, to the level they were in the 1990s, to aim for something like 500,000 deer in Scotland. I mean, these are very broad terms, broad numbers, but if that's the sort of scale of the task, we currently kill or cull around 200,000 deer a year. We think we probably need to do an extra 50,000 a year for the next 10 years in order to reduce numbers to around half. There's some pretty big assumptions in there, but that is the sort of scale of the task. It's not small.
Okay, just another final question, just about the language. I'm just seeing that the words competent to shoot a deer is to be substituted with fit and competent. Can you tell us about what fit means in terms of fit and competent?
Well, in terms of those two words, fit specifically really refers rather to firearms licence, that you are fit to do that. Competent is really about how you do that.
And the firearms licence, and is that the DSC 1 certification?
That's more about the competence.
Okay.
So the DSC 1 is a competence training level, and it sets out various things about marksmanship, identification of deer, safety in shooting and growlicking and so on, and that's managing of deer after they've been shot.
Okay, thanks, convener.
Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, convener. Can I ask how Nature Scot will approach the control agreements and control schemes under the provisions of the bill, and how these new rules and agreements differ from those in the past?
In terms of the process, the broad process where Nature Scot seek information from people through the sort of deer management plan process, and where they then aim to enter into a voluntary agreement in order to achieve the sort of objectives that they believe are necessary on the land, and that where those voluntary agreements then either work and the job is done, or they don't work, or Nature Scot take the view that they're not able to work, and they then move to consideration of a compulsory process. Those are broadly the same as they were in the 1996 legislation. There is now the inclusion of the new trigger for intervention around restoration and enhancement, but in terms of actually the process of reaching the various stages in the process, the sort of information gathering process, the voluntary stage and then the compulsory stage, those are broadly the same. There are some changes to the detail in there, but that is broadly the same.
Can I just, is there provision, and this kind of maybe harkens back a wee bit to Emma Harper's question, but where deer are causing a nuisance either to tenant farmers or indeed just the community, as often happens, what powers do they have to trigger intervention by Nature Scot?
Well, tenant farmers and others in that sort of situation do have powers to take deer where they are causing damage to their crops. So that power has been in previous legislation and remains within legislation. So there isn't a big change there, but it's not solely the responsibility or the ability of landowners to take action in those circumstances. Where deer are causing a nuisance, I think it's again, it's in the first instance, the responsibility would lie with the land managers and the landowners, the people who have the right to take those deer, to ensure that that they were not causing a nuisance to communities and others. However, there are also powers under Section 10 emergency powers where Nature Scot could also intervene and take action, and if necessary, use contractors, and if necessary, reclaim costs. So that would be the broad mechanism where that sort of danger or problems for communities were being caused where the intervention would occur.
Okay, so that wouldn't have to be that they were damaging the natural environment or biodiversity. That could be that they were causing damage locally, because we know that, you know, tenant farmers can control deer, but only if they catch them on their land. They can't really go off their own tenanted land to deal with the problem, and same for communities.
No, I mean, there are a broad range of reasons for intervention, and one of the key ones of those obviously is public safety, and that comes into play in particular around road vehicle collisions and so on. And there are then sort of powers for Nature Scot to intervene or to require land managers to intervene.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask for clarity on that? So I'm not clear on just exactly where the responsibility does lie, and if a deer notice is to be issued. You know, the bill states landowner and or manager. So if a landowner has an agreement in place, whether that's a tenancy or potentially a stalking licence or shooting rights or whatever, does the deer notice get issued to those with the stalking or the shooting rights or the tenant? And by default, if there's no agreement in place, does that responsibility then land with the landowner? So the issue here is that where deer are causing agricultural damage within the terms of the Act, that the land manager there, the farmer, can take action. But it's more her or himself to deal with those deer. So that's a separate issue from where deer are causing damage to the wider environment, where then, as you say, that would be then the expectation is in the first place that the landowner responsible for those deer, who has the right to take those deer, takes action, and if they don't take the appropriate action, then the intervention process can start. Yeah, I'm still unclear. So if I own a piece of land and I have a tenancy agreement in place, where does the deer notice? If deer that are on my property are causing road accidents or straying into another area or eating trees or whatever, where does it actually sit? Is in the absence of some agreement of who's responsible, so that might be the tenant or it might be who has the shooting rights, in the absence of any agreement, does it default to the landowner?
So in terms of the giving of notice, as regards deer management plans, the notice may be issued to either the relevant owner or relevant occupier, and it would be for Nature Scot to take into account the circumstances and the particular relationship that you've described, and to make sure that the notice is given to the correct relevant owner or occupier, and by that I mean the person who is best placed to prepare the deer management plan, and that will be something that presumably Nature Scot will be considering alongside when having informal discussions prior to the issuing of notice to require a submission of a deer management plan.
Okay, I can see that having issues in the future about the legal obligations in the absence of any legal agreement.
I'm not sure that that's changing
No.
in any substantive way. So, I mean, I think that's been an issue for a long time. But I think broadly, it's pretty clear who has the responsibility for deer management on a piece of land, and it may be a tenant farm in some circumstances, but I think more usually it's the landowner.
Okay.
That kind of thing can be set out in leases. So, for example, if a landowner will have the right to own deer as being the landowner, but the land manager may or may not have the right to take deer depending on leases or other formal agreements that are in place between the tenant and the landowner.
Okay, thank you. Eleanor Whittam and then Tim Eagle.
Thanks, Convener. When you were responding to the question from my colleague Emma Harper with regards to the changes that the bill makes in terms of the creation and approving of deer management plans, you mentioned about the need for collaborative working across land holdings as being, quite fundamental to that. And I'm just wondering what regard was paid to the very different issues that are experienced in the lowlands of Scotland, so down in the area that I represent in terms of deer management, where you have a lot of very much more smaller land holdings, a lot of different moving parts there, and maybe not as much collaboration happening, as well as numbers of stockers being reduced, etc. in the area, no community larders. So I'm just wondering what thought went into how we ensure that we have robust deer management in the lowlands of Scotland, given that it's a very different situation, but one that still needs to be addressed.
Yes, absolutely right. It's a very difficult issue. Clearly, in the Highlands and Open Hill areas of Scotland, where there are established arrangements, procedures, collaborations in place, where there are fairly large land holdings, these things are easier to manage, and it's very easy to focus on those. We are very aware, though, that the sort of numbers of roe deer in woodland in lowland Scotland are, we think, very high. We think there's evidence of high levels of damage to native woodland. It's very difficult to assess deer numbers in woodland, but there is good evidence from the sort of impacts to show that those are high numbers there. And as you say, the land holdings are small. The deer aren't as mobile as they are in the sort of red deer range, so the sort of need for collaboration is not the same. But clearly we do need to understand more about what goes on there, to understand how we can put in place arrangements to ensure that those deer numbers are better controlled than they are. This bill puts in place various arrangements, but I don't think it actually is going to solve that issue on its own. We need better data. We need to understand. We need to get the message across to people that there is a need to manage these deer. And you mentioned things like community larders. These will be important ways that we can facilitate improved deer management in the lowlands, and also important ways in which we can gather more information about who is managing deer there and what their needs are and so on. I mean, part of it is the management of deer in the lowlands is done in commercial forestry by professional contractors and rangers, but in sort of large numbers of, or the large areas of woodland which surround farmland and so on, it's usually recreational stalkers, and they, for the most part, they're highly competent and they know what they're doing, but they're not very inclined to be forthcoming about, what they're doing, how many deer are being killed, what arrangements there are and to collaborate with other stalkers and so on. So we're doing our best to try and make that happen by sort of, one of the ways that we think will be a useful way of gathering information about what happens in Lowland Scotland is through the use of incentive schemes requiring people to register if they want to take part in an incentive scheme and to provide data on exactly what is happening in the lowlands. But for the most part, it is a difficult issue.
Okay, that's very helpful, and I think the mention of the incentive schemes is quite good to have a marker down, because I do think that the provisions contained within the bill are maybe not going to address the issue as you rightly point out, but I think it's something that the committee needs to be very aware of in the lowlands. Thanks.
I've got a supplementary specifically on the response that Elena got there, and then Tim Eagle and Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to, while we're in that kind of space around deer larders and people eating venison.
No, I'm not. There's a question on that.
Yeah, but it's different. It's about lead shot. It's about killing the deer. So, so I'm aware that there's work being done on the ban, potentially ban on lead shot, or a ban on large caliber bullets that are used for deer management. And I know that we don't necessarily need legislation for that, but I just wonder if there's consideration in that in what you're doing around the deer management work in this bill that acknowledges that if we're going to look at that, killing the deer on the hill and how we do that, and then that's going to go to human consumption. Are you considering that? To switch?
There is a separate process that's going on, which is looking through the UK REACH process, which is looking at a UK-wide ban on the use of lead ammunition. And that is sort of moving ahead and will come to fruition fairly shortly. Separately, in terms of the use of lead ammunition in deer, it's to a very large extent it's being driven by the market. So in terms of the large sort of processors of venison are not accepting deer shot with lead. Most of the supermarkets won't accept venison that's been shot with lead. So there is pressure on that from that direction, and there will also be likely changes in the broader legislation on a UK-wide basis fairly shortly.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Tim Eagle.
Yes, thank you. It was just to try and just get a little bit more clarity around the deer management plans effectively and how that will work in operation. I mean, just out of curiosity, do you see that as effectively the same as deer management nature restoration orders? I mean, how are they different, if that makes sense?
As I said earlier, deer management plans are something which are widely in use now and have been for many years, and that is a plan which is something put together by a deer management group. Again, not something which we see in the lowlands very often, but
in the lowlands,
in sort of where we have large-scale collaboration. So those DMGs will usually have a plan, and that plan will set out what they intend to do to ensure effective deer management in that area. But Nature Scot and other government agencies are usually on those deer management groups and are aware of what those plans are, and so on, and they are aware of how effective DMGs are in delivering those plans. So what we're talking about, when we talk about deer management plans in the bill, this is about where Nature Scot are not satisfied with the quality of a plan or the delivery of a plan, and then start the process under the provisions in the bill where they say it's not compatible with the new requirements in section 6, and ask, can we therefore see your plan, and can we then start that process of agreeing a plan or otherwise.
So you don't foresee this being used very much?
I don't see it being used on a basis which covers the whole of Scotland, certainly not. Yeah. Do I see it being used more than it is now? Probably, but not. I mean, it's not something where Nature Scot are not going to be in a position where they enter into a formal process with regard to every deer management plan produced by every DMG.
And what's the process? So Nature Scott decide, because it's quite subjective, isn't it, around that nature restoration stuff. So Nature Scott say, we're not happy, so we want a plan. But does it go straight to the plan? Can there be a period of discussion before a plan needs to be made, where Nature Scott can say, actually, look, if you do this, then we probably don't need to go to that extent? Or does it have to jump to a plan? And I guess... what evidence, if the landowner said, well, actually, I think we are doing everything, what evidence could the landowner supply to Nature Scott to say, well, actually, we disagree with you here. We don't think we are, whatever you're saying to us, we think actually we are abiding by.
Well, I think a plan is a pretty fundamental thing for a deer management group, or for any group of, or indeed any individual land manager managing deer, is to have a plan. Well, what are you going to be doing about managing deer? I guess in some circumstances the plan might be, well, we don't need to do very much. But for most deer managers, it's going to be, we need to take action because, without any natural predators, deer need to be controlled. And if they're not controlled, they will have an impact on the environment. So there needs to be a plan. So I don't think saying you need a plan and can we see it is a big step in itself. I think the issue then will be is we don't think this plan delivers for the environment, for the public good.
But that's the question I'm asking, isn't it? Is there might be a plan in place, but at some point Nature Scott have decided that that's not delivering what they want it to deliver. So at that point, I'm saying, can there just be a period of discussion before any further process needs to go down? And where that plan does, and then Nature Scott might come back to that and say, well, actually, we still disagree with you, but is there a process by which the landowner can provide evidence to Nature Scott? Is there an appeals process to that, effectively? Or does the landowner not have the power to disagree? They just have to do what Nature Scott say?
I think Nature Scott needs to specify why the plan is deficient and whatever, but ultimately, no, Nature Scott can require that a plan is produced.
Okay, right.
Just a quick question about deer plans for urban and peri-urban deer. Just a quick search of the explanatory notes and the bill, the word urban isn't mentioned, but I know there's good practice guidance already for managing deer in urban and peri-urban areas in our towns and cities. So just to clarify, there doesn't need to be formalised deer management plans for urban areas, or is deer management a problem in our towns and cities as well?
There are deer issues in some urban and peri-urban areas, and some local authorities do have plans and resources in place to deal with that. I think it could be better, but it's not. We're not sort of saying that that's the sort of top of the priority list. But yes, certainly there are issues in some peri-urban areas. I mean, quite often these issues are around road safety. And a lot of local authorities will have plans to deal with that in terms of fencing and planning of roads and junctions and so on.
Okay, thanks.
Does Glasgow City Council have a deer management plan?
As far as I'm aware, no. I don't believe that Glasgow City Council are managing deer at present.
Okay, I'm a bit confused. You said there was Nature Scott, but ultimately could just say the plan is the plan, but there is a Section 2, Part 3 does have an appeal process. Schedule 2.
The intention is that the amendments made by the bill as regards the plan agreement scheme approach is intended to fit within the current framework of intervention, and the policy intention is that it will invariably start off with that voluntary discussion, and indeed that's the approach that is put in place in the bill. But as we go down the plan into agreement into scheme, there are various safeguards that are put in place by virtue of the provisions in the bill. For example, as I've just mentioned, the intention is that it would always start off with that voluntary discussion, and then there is at a later stage when there will be the ability at the point of, for example, schemes, there'll be the ability to make objections to the Scottish ministers as regards to any proposed scheme or as regards any proposed modifications that the Scottish Ministers may be seeking to make, and then ultimately there is, on confirmation or of the scheme, for example, there is the right of appeal to the Scottish Land Court, so that does exist as well.
So that's what wasn't clear. So there is the ability to appeal. Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Convener, I'm going to go into the space of preventing or stopping deer damage or damage by deer. I think you already kind of started to go into that, Hugh, when you were responding to the convener earlier on. But I'm going to ask again and just line it up with Section 19 and Section 20. So what prompted the need for the changes in the bill regarding preventing deer damage? Is my first question.
Sorry, what prevented?
What prompted the need for the changes in the bill regarding preventing deer damage by deer?
Well, as I said earlier, it's broadly around reactive intervention as opposed to proactive intervention. So around damage, it's essentially a reactive process. It's about that there is damage occurring and likely to occur in the future, or damage that has occurred. And around that, there are a number of issues around assessment of that damage, especially outside of protected sites where there is not the adequate sort of baseline data. There are also a number of issues around if one is looking at, for example, restoration of a river basin, there'll be a number of different land holdings along that river basin with varying degrees of data available on the damage that's been caused. So it's really about being able to take a proactive view that says that the presence of high deer numbers is preventing the achievement of a plan or achievement of a natural process. And it's being able to then sort of intervene on the basis of reducing deer numbers to allow that plan or process to take place.
Okay, so just clarifying. So currently we're in a more reactive mode to what's going on, yes. And now this bill, these provisions are going to allow people to act proactively. Okay, that's helpful. And then on Section 20, what led to the introduction of provisions in the bill for legal defence for actions taken to prevent harm from deer?
Sorry, we're talking about... Yeah. Yep. Again, this is a deer working group recommendation. And I guess it's a matter of sort of clarification here, really. I don't think there was probably any real risk of people being at risk of sort of legal action if they intervene to prevent sort of risks to human life, human safety. But I think this is just clarifying that.
Okay.
Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. I wonder if you could explain what the motivation was behind modifying the powers for Nature Scot authorised individuals, and how do you believe these changes are necessary?
I think that, again, this is one of the sort of issues, if I'm talking about the same thing here, again, a sort of DWG recommendation, it's about where there is some sort of intervention required, and that intervention may require actions to be taken which would otherwise be unlawful, but sort of ensuring that Nature Scot staff or other contractors approved by them who are taking part in that action are not committing an offence. As it happens, I think in practice, Nature Scot usually license and individually authorise those people. But this is again a sort of safeguard, making sure that staff who are carrying out an intervention, which might include, for example, shooting deer out of season, are not liable to prosecution by virtue of that they are exempted by what's here in the proposed provisions.
So is this increasing their powers?
No, I don't think it's increasing their powers. I think it's ensuring that they're not subject to prosecution.
Okay. And how will that improve deer management practices? Could you spell out how that will work?
Again, I'm not certain that this is going to change what happens on the ground. So, as I say, this is the sort of situation where Nature Scot intervene in deer management. It could be under the emergency powers, so they need to take action to prevent a deer welfare issue, or perhaps sort of a road safety issue or something like that. And that involves doing things which would otherwise require a licence. So in other words, shooting deer out of season or shooting deer at night. Now, this provision will mean that the contractors or the Nature Scot staff who are doing that work, in effect, don't need that licence. So it's not really changing things on the ground, but it is ensuring that when they're doing that work, they're not liable to prosecution for doing something that would otherwise be unlawful.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's slightly around that, but you've obviously changed the authorisation system for taking or killing deer during the closed season or at night or using vehicles. So I guess what is the primary motivation for that, and how do you think that's going to help with deer management in Scotland, which is, I suppose, one of the fundamental aims of this section of the bill?
There's an element of simplification here.
Okay.
So it's about ensuring that when people are on the fit and competent register, that they are then considered fit and competent to do those sort of things like shoot out of season,
yeah,
or shoot out at night, or shoot at night. Not all, the same rules don't apply across the board there. So I mean, shooting at night will require, if you to be on the fit and competent register, that you have done the appropriate training for shooting at night. So with regards to the shooting out of season, or the shooting at night, or the use of shotguns, or the use of vehicles to drive deer, those, if you don't need further authorisation from Nature Scot to do those things, although you do need for the out of season license, the out of season shooting, that will need further authorisation, and shooting at night will still require, for example, that someone shooting out at night, even with fit and competent qualification, informs the police beforehand. So there are still some degrees of control in there, but it's trying to prevent people having to be individually authorised to do those activities. That being on the fit and competent register gets you sort of so far in itself.
And see with the fit and competent, because obviously before it was just competent, now it's fit and competent. So what does the addition of that fit mean to you in terms of the bill? And obviously there's a lot of people. What we don't want to do, or presumably you don't want to do, is to decrease the number of stalkers we have in Scotland, because actually we need them to carry on. So, I mean, are you considering things like grandfather rights to those that are already clearly able and have been doing this for a long period of time?
Well, that's not on the face of the bill, as you know. That's potentially to be considered when we bring forward a scheme under secondary legislation. But yes, I mean, that is one of the considerations, whether or not to give people some sort of rights who are sort of already got existing skills and experience. I don't think a view has been formed on that, whether or not that will be...
But okay, that's fine, because it's not on the face of the bill, but I was just curious if that had gone through your mind in the process of the bill, but that's something we can discuss, obviously, as we take more evidence. But what about the purpose of putting in the fit part?
Yeah.
What's the purpose of that?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, the term fit generally refers to the fact that they are qualified to do that.
Okay.
So, in firearms certificate. And so, again, this is to be determined in what actually you need to do to be on that fit and competent register will be part of the scheme to be brought forward under regulations.
Okay. But do you have any thought on what that would be at this point in time?
Well, we think DSC1 is the likely level.
Yeah. Okay. That's it.
Just to add to that, it's obviously something that we will be speaking to stakeholders about, because there's DSC1, there's also some other qualifications that I'm aware of that other organisations run, and you mentioned grandfather rights. So it's really important that before bringing forward that legislation, we take the time to speak to the people who are going to be doing the work in the future, or who are doing the work in the future, to understand their thoughts and views as to the appropriate range and level of qualifications that would be a requirement of that register. So it's very much something we'll be looking to actively engage stakeholders with if this bill is passed.
Cool. I mean, that's good to hear. I mean, this is just for clarity, because we're already getting these questions, so that's what I would have assumed it would be. But it's good to have that on record so we know what we are looking at moving forward.
Yes, I mean, that's a sort of, it's there or thereabouts, as Leah says. There may be other people who are providing training who will also, at that level. We also know that, as I mentioned before, the use of night sites not currently within DSC1. So there will be changes, but it will be subject to discussion with practitioners for sure.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
When it comes to authorisation for particular activities, the focus has changed from land types, land use, to specific reasons for authorisation. So we've heard for damage by deer or nature restoration. What benefits do you see in that approach?
Well, the primary benefit, Convener, as I said before, is bringing that consistency across the whole range of activities which are covered by the sort of deer management activity. So it's the same purposes around intervention by Nature Scott are also the same sort of purposes that we can authorise people to shoot at night or out of season or whatever else is being required.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to now move on to our next topic. Question from Eleanor Whittam.
Section 32 of the bill inserts provisions into the 1996 Act which deal with the liability for taking or killing stray farmed deer. In particular, it introduces an offence of failing to report the taking or killing of a stray farmed deer, and a defence of civil liability for taking or killing a stray farmed deer. Now, I'm wondering, what were the reasons for introducing these provisions regarding stray farm deer, and is it believed that they're actually going to effectively help the management of stray farm deer? Because it seems to me, looking at it, it looks at the liability of the person who's actually taken that farm deer versus the effective management of preventing stray farmed deer from escaping in the first place.
This is a DWG recommendation, and they felt that there was clear legislation in governing the circumstances for taking or killing other kind of forms of livestock, for cows and sheep, but they felt legislation was ambiguous in relation to what people's obligations were in relation to stray farmed deer specifically. So this was put in to address what the DWD had felt was a deficit, and just kind of have that clarity which they already exists in relation to other forms of livestock.
Okay, so it's specifically about those dealing with that versus actually how we support farmers of farmed deer to ensure that they don't have escapes into the wild.
Yes, it was to address the DW recommendation about the current ambiguity in the legislation.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to now move on to our final set of questions. Kick off with Emma Harper.
Thank you very much again, Convener. So I know it's been touched on earlier about community larders and the availability for venison to go into the food supply chain. So what would be the main reason for removing the requirement for a licence to deal in venison, and how will this change make venison more accessible to consumers, but while ensuring it meets food safety standards?
I mean, the primary reason here is the view from most of the people that we spoke to that this doesn't really have any particular function, the venison dealer's licence. That venison, like any other food or game, is already subject to the food standards requirements, and that is really the most effective way of protecting public safety in this.
And I know that, when we had a roundtable evidence session, we talked about making venison more available and more appealing, and changing the perception that it's not just for people that have got deep pockets and big wallets. So how will this then support, I suppose, widening access for schools, hospitals, other places, for instance?
Well, I don't think it will particularly, that this particular provision won't have a big impact on that, but it will remove one of the sort of restrictions on the general availability of venison, to remove the venison dealer's licence. But I mean, there aren't many of them in place. I think something like 26 in Scotland. So it's not a big issue which is sort of inhibiting the supply of venison. I think there are much broader issues to be dealt with there in terms of making venison more widely available and making it, you know, part of the sort of diet in schools and hospitals or wherever. This is one small part of that, but this is really about removing something which really doesn't have any function now.
Okay, and Food Standards Scotland would be part of supporting wider access to venisons. That would be some collaborative and engagement with Food Standards Scotland to ensure safety, but also help support that widening access.
Certainly ensuring safety. I don't know if their remit is about marketing, but I mean, the Scottish Government does support the sort of the venison industry with promotion and marketing material, and would like to, certainly, if we are looking to see a significant increase in the number of animals culled, we want to be very sure that those are being put to productive use. And as you say, venison is a healthy, lean, nutritious meat, and we'd like to see better use made of it. We'd like to see that feeding through to the people who are producing that venison. So we absolutely support that.
Okay, thanks.
So, you know, one of the objectives is to increase availability, but maintaining the high standards. So if Section 33 is repealed, the need for a licence to deal in venison, how can we ensure those high food standards are maintained?
Because venison, as I say, like any other meat or game meat in particular, is already subject to Food Standards Scotland, their requirements, and it will continue to be so. That is the prime main way in which it's sort of maintaining high standards and ensuring that the meat is of a high quality. That's the means by which that is delivered.
So if you have a recreational stalker that shoots a deer, how can you ensure those high food standards, that the carcass has been treated in a certain way, as opposed to someone who's a professional stalker who's been through the licensing, has dealt with a dealer? So if I was a recreational, and at the end of the day, all I need to have is a rifle licence to be fit and proper. So how can you ensure that someone like me as a recreational stalker can ensure that the high food standards are maintained?
Well, go on.
I was just going to say, so venison is governed by exactly the same food standards legislation as other meat and wild game. So if somebody, you know, whether you're a professional stalker or whether you're just recreationally shooting grouse, for example. So all of that legislation is in place. The venison licence was an additional thing, and my understanding of it, that was primarily put in place not for reasons of food safety, but for reasons of traceability in regards to poaching. But whether you are a mass producer of venison or whether you are just somebody recreation shooting, you're governed by the same legislation in terms of the hygiene rules, etc., that you have to follow.
There was something that you said at the end there. So how do you ensure traceability?
So that's something that we can write to the committee with more information in relation to the work that Food Standards undertakes more widely in relation to the kind of regulation of meat and game.
So I'm just concerned that we're completely taking away a licence which it sort of ensures that, but there's nothing in its place.
So this was something that we consulted on, and the majority of people who responded to the consultation supported the provisions to remove it. They felt it was an unnecessary barrier. It was no longer required, and that's why we're removing it. In response to those consultations, we also consulted with local authorities as well, and they didn't have any concerns about the repeal of the venison licence.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. So thank you very much once again. We've come in on time, so that's very much appreciated. So thank you to all our witnesses for giving evidence this morning. We're now going to go into private session and suspend the meeting for 5 minutes.